Hello, fellow birders. My name is Denis Kania. Today we're going to be taking a look at identifying warblers when you're looking up into the trees and all you can see are their underparts. On the DuPage Birding Club Education channel, we'll be discussing all things bird-related. As I mentioned, today we'll be looking at warblers from below, and this is a two-part series. So today we'll be just discussing part one. When I set out to start this project, I thought about the fact that we have 35 warbler species that show up in DuPage County. And so if I was going to draw all of them, I'd have to create 70 images. And so I decided I'd like to cut that down a little bit. So we actually left a few species out, those birds that we are probably not likely to see from below. So those would be things like Connecticut Warbler and Morning Warbler, both of the water thrushes. And so that eliminated 8 drawings right away. And then for some of the females, I felt it wasn't necessary to incorporate those illustrations as well. So we have 51 drawings here. And when you look at this, it's a bit challenging. There's quite a few images. So we want to break that down. And we'll only talk about half of the birds today. And the birds we're going to talk about are the subset of warblers that have some kind of streaking on the underparts. And so you can see this is still kind of a large task. We're dealing with about 25 images here. So we want to cut that down even further. And so the way I approached that was to focus on all of the streaked warblers that have really a lot of yellow on the underparts. And that's what all of these birds have in common. But when you look at this subset, you can see right away that there are certain individuals that stand out. There are key features that we can look at. And those features would include the color structure of the underside of the tail. And you can see there are differences in all of these birds. The color of the undertail coverage would be a key thing to get. And then just how much streaking there is, where that streaking is confined to. Those are all other features we should look at. So we'll start out breaking this down a little bit. And so 2 birds out of this group that really stand out right away are the yellow warbler and the Magnolia Warbler, because they have very unique undertail patterns. Yellow warbler is the only warbler we have in all of North America that has yellow underside to the tail. So you can see here it's all yellow, and nothing else will have that. And certainly there are other features that you would notice about this, especially if you have the male. You can see that it has a lot of streaking, and it's going to be chestnut in color. The female would be a little trickier. Sometimes she'll show some diffuse streaking, but quite often streaking is nearly absent. But you have the key feature of the underside of the tail and the fact that it's very yellow there. So that's very unique. Another bird that has a unique tail pattern would be the Magnolia Warbler. It does have white in the underside of the tail, but that white is confined to the more or less to the base of the tail. And then you have a very dark area out here at the end of the tail. And no other warbler has a tail pattern like that. So this is a very unique tail pattern. You can see a lot of streaking on this bird, and certainly that would be a clue as well. But we do have a lot of other bright yellow breasted birds that have a lot of streaking. So the key feature would be that underside of the tail. Here's a problem that we have with Blackburnian warbler and yellow-throated warbler. They are very, very similar. And surprisingly, depending on the lighting that you're viewing these birds in, it can be difficult to separate them, because this is not really a bright yellow on the throat of the yellow-throated warbler. It's kind of an egg yolk white, or yellow rather. And so in certain lighting situations, it can look almost orangish comparing then to Blackburnian. So we have to look at something besides the color of that throat. And they both have streaking that is concentrated in the flank area. Their tail patterns are very much similar. So we don't have a lot to go on. But what we can realize on Blackburnian warblers is that the flanks do have a wash of cream color running in the base color of these flank area. So it will look slightly different than what we're seeing here, where the streaking is on clean white versus that cream color. So there is a slight difference in those two birds. So you'd have to look very carefully, but it is doable. Now, out of the group that we've subdivided out, those that have streaking on the breast and a lot of yellow, there's only two species that out of that group that actually have yellow undertail coverts, and that would be palm warbler and prairie warbler. The streaking on palm warblers is not real strong. We have two different races to deal with here. This is the eastern race where it looks very, very yellow, and then the western race, the yellow is confined to the throat area and to the undertail coverts. And so when we look at that streaking pattern and we compare that to what we see on the prairie warbler, you can see that it's much stronger on that prairie warbler. And another feature that you can look at would be the patterning on the underside of the tail. In this case, the white spots in the tail are confined more to the end of the tail, and actually the base of the tail is dark. And that's quite different than what we're seeing in this prairie warbler, where it looks like the whole tail underside is whitish. So there is that difference, but you should be able to separate those two without too much difficulty. Here we have two individuals that look quite similar, Cape May warbler and pine warbler. And certainly if you saw these birds and saw some of their other field marks from above, it'd be easy to separate those. But when you're looking from underneath, it becomes a little more challenging. Cape May warbler, what I always notice about this bird, one of the first things that strikes me when I see a Cape May warbler is the fact that the streaking on the underparts is very uniform. It's very crisp, and they're finer streaks than what you see in a lot of our other warblers. And the patterning of that streaking is more evenly distributed all across the breast. In many of our other warblers, the heavier streaking is always confined to the flank areas. But in this case, that streaking is well distributed all the way across the breast. And so that's a unique feature for the Cape May warbler. Female will have maybe paler streaking, but it does have that same fine streaking, very crisp looking streaking. And so that does look different than any of our other warblers. Pine warbler, similar patterning, but it is heavier streaking. It is a heavier billed bird, and that might be difficult to detect. So this is one of the birds, the female here may show a little bit of streaking, but it may not. And so this might be one of those birds you end up having to walk away from. This is actually a pretty difficult ID from underneath without any other characteristics to go on. So this will be a very tough one. I will not lie to you. But if you do get a female that shows maybe a little more streaking on the other side, then you might have a chance with this bird. Otherwise, it will be very difficult. The last two that we have that have a lot of yellow on the underside would be the northern Parula and Canada warbler. And these two birds are both very unique compared to all the others that we've been talking about so far, in that they have interesting patterns across the upper breast. In the case of the northern Parula, you have two bands on the male. The upper band here on the lower part of the throat is actually a slate color or leaning almost towards blackish. And I've seen some individuals, and especially depending on the angle that you're looking at the bird, where it appears that this dark area actually goes well up into the throat. It makes the throat look like it's black. But below that, you'll also have this rufusy band. And so the combination of those two color bands, plus the fact that it does have a pinkish bill, at least the lower mandible is pinkish, those are all clues to who you're looking at. And structurally, this bird looks short-tailed. This one and actually Cerulean Warbler is another individual that looks very short-tailed. But that would be another feature that you can go for. The Canada Warbler, I think people are pretty familiar with the necklace of streaks on that bird. And you can see that well defined here. So the male should be quite easy to recognize. And the female will have diffuse streaking, and it's very, very difficult to pick up at times, but it does have that streak. But out of all the birds that we've talked about so far, this is one of the individuals that does have an all black tail. And so that's unique so far as what we've discussed to this point. So we've covered half of the birds that have a lot of streaking on the underparts. those that had all that yellow. So now we're going to deal with the group that's either totally lacking yellow or has just very, very little bit of yellow. And we'll again start to break this down little by little. So two birds to consider that are very unique would be ovenbird and black and white warbler. And what's unique about the ovenbird is that the streaking here is very, very brownish in color. And out of this whole subset, this will be the only one that has an all dark tail. So out of this entire group, we only have two birds that have all dark tails. In the group that lacks yellow in the underparts, we have the ovenbird. In the individual or in the subset that has a lot of yellow underneath, it turns out to be that Canada warbler. But out of that whole half of all of our warblers, we only are dealing with two species that have an all dark tail. The black and white warbler has a very unique feature as well, and that's the fact that its undertail coverts, which is this area here, you can see that they have dark markings in both the male and the female. And of all of our North American warblers in the eastern half of the United States, this is the only one that has any kind of markings in the undertail coverts, or at least black markings in the undertail coverts. So very unique features, which makes both of these birds easy to identify. This group is a little trickier. This is Blackpool warbler and Cerulean warbler, and at least the males do have some very unique features. In the case of the Blackpool warbler, it has very, very strong malar stripes, which would show up quite clearly even on the underside of the bird. If that's all you could see was the underside, you'd still be able to see those really strong malar stripes. And it does have a lot of black streaking and more or less confined to the flanks. The female is going to have a very similar pattern. The streaking is maybe not quite as strong, and the bird may not look to be as clean white. This illustration maybe is over exaggerating that a little bit. It should probably be a little whiter looking than what I'm representing here, but you kind of still get the idea. The patterning is the same as the male, just a little finer or lighter streaking. The unique feature on the Cerulean warbler would be the fact that it does have that black collar and then goes into the streaking. As I mentioned earlier, it's one of those two birds that has a very short looking tail, and so that helps structurally, it helps this bird stand out. The female could be pretty tricky, and it might again be somebody you have to walk away from, but on occasion you do get Cerulean females that will show a slight collar. It might just look like a little gray band. It won't be strong like this. And they will have diffuse streaking, so you can look for that. In this case, that throat is not going to be as white as you see on the male. It will have kind of a creamy wash to it. So these two birds, surprisingly, can give you a few problems. Yellow-rumped warbler and black-throated green. When you see the male of the black-throated green, it should be quite obvious because it's all black through the throat, and that black starts to extend down into the upper breast and into the flanks, and then turns into very bold streaking. The female will not have as strong of a pattern. In many cases, the throat is not black. It might be up here grayish because of some speckling, but for the most part, it will look similar to what we're seeing here. You can see it's very heavy around the upper breast area, and you're seeing the same pattern here. And then heavy streaking in both cases going down the flanks. But what's different between the two is where you find a little bit of yellowish wash. And in the case of the black-throated green, it's going to be at the lower part of the flanks, and it will be kind of an olivey yellow wash, and very, very faint. It's not that easy to pick up. On a yellow-rumped warbler, whether it's male or female, you should be able to see this little yellowish spot at the upper flank area. So there is a way to separate those two out. So birders become pretty frustrated with the lack of helpful features when they do see these warblers way up in the canopy above them. Certainly it would be great to see some of those other features, but the birds don't always cooperate. So we'll do our very best with the limited features that we can see. And those features that we do want to focus on would be all those different things that you can see from the underside. The underside of the tail, the undertail coverts, the patterning that you have on the breast, and then any throat color may also in some cases be helpful. But you'll find as you start to sort through all of those features that there are unique groupings or subsets within the larger group. And as you slice and dice that down into more manageable groups, you'll find that there are unique combinations of those features, and you should be able to identify most, if not all, of your warblers when you're seeing them from below. So just like anything else, it takes some time and it takes some practice. And so in this tutorial, we've reviewed only half of the warblers that can be seen in DuPage County. So stay tuned for Warblers from Below Part 2. And thanks for taking the time to view this video, and hopefully we've given you some bird food for thought. And I hope you'll join us again in the future as we explore all things bird related.